This is broadcast number 655. It's June 25th, 1984. I'm going to skip the subjects that I had last year because it's hard to remember yesterday or a week ago. The news is going by so quickly. Briefly, it was about the Posse Comitatus, the far right wing, the people in Kansas City that were surfacing, and in California. There are links to Nazi Germany and also to the Philippines, to Charles Willoughby, who was head of intelligence for General Douglas MacArthur. And I was continuing the links of the Los Angeles Police Department to Larry McDonald. That was 1 year ago tonight, and as I say, the world spins very, very quickly. I was outraged at another speech that George Shultz gave yesterday. I'm really mad. It's getting sort of like the movie Network, the story of Patty Chayefsky. I'm not going to take it anymore. This is the effort of George Shultz to have permission to murder leaders around the world to his own liking. The paper had a story this morning, preemptive measures. Shultz asks the anti-terrorist action. And in essence, what he says is that the experience has taught us over the years that one of the best deterrents to terrorism is the certainty that swift and sure measures will be taken against those who engage in it. Now, he is going to define terrorism, George Shultz. He expressed anger at what he said was the insidious claim that one man's terrorist is another man's fighter. This reminds me of the song License to Kill, the latest album of Bob Dylan. I wrote down some of the words before I came here, but I'm going to take the whole thing and get it for you and read it to you. It's a song about how certain people have the right or think they have the right to run your lives and have that license to kill. This isn't a new thing which he just discovered, George Shultz. As a matter of fact, another front page story in the Monterey Herald says Shultz calls for new approach. This team has used that method since the Versailles Treaty when World War I was over, killing thousands of people in Germany, 10 or 20,000, all the politicians, professors, opponents to Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich and the Nazi Party. Experience has taught us, he says, over the years. Sure it did. John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Adlai Stevenson, John Lennon, Medgar Evers, Che Guevara, you name it. Death squads. These people have had the license to kill. What they're saying now, the Reagan administration is saying, give us the legal permission to kill people who are congregating in groups of 5 or 10. What was the SLA? 10 people? 6 were cremated alive on the television from the LA Police Department SWAT teams. That's why my article, The SLA is the CIA, 10 years ago, is so important. Book-length article. This was the beginning of the license to kill and barbecue you on the evening television and sell you the whole script. And then Patty Hearst and the Harrises go off in the yonder and sail away and come back and are all living happily ever after. It isn't a new approach, which is what the wire services said today. And experience has taught him indeed. And all they need now is to decide who are terrorists or who are housing terrorists. They cite Libya and Syria and Iran and North Korea. Who armed Libya? Who sent the money over there to Gaddafi? Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple and the Task Force 157 and the Central Intelligence Agency, Carlos and all of them. Who armed Iran and sent the weapons to the Shah and the Savak and still arms Iran, even with Khomeini there? And I'll do a little bit more on that in a little while. Read the story of Syria and how the CIA formed this government in Syria with Nazis, and our intelligence system formed this government. Where did terrorism come from? We put them in the bag of being terrorists so we could control the world. That was the shtick. Create the terrorism, let them be called terrorists, and then we will crack down on everybody, and you'll have your pass cards and your concentration camps. It is outrageous what they want to make legal, just like last week Reagan got through the Congress that you can send troops down to Central America, El Salvador and Nicaragua. You don't need covert action anymore. The Congress says you can send troops. So that makes it legal. They learned from the last war, I suppose, that if Adolf Hitler had permission to go into Poland and Czechoslovakia and Austria and so forth, it would have been legal. Well, this is what the government wants now, the license to kill under the excuse of terrorism. It's enough to make you vomit or at least be angry. There were several articles quickly to mention that I call the unmitigated nerve of the world. One was Henry Kissinger warning about debt problems in South America and provoking political confrontation. Who in the world does Henry Kissinger think he is? And many of you know what I think of him as the number one Nazi spy in this country. He's on the board of Chase Manhattan. His wife is a full-paid employee of Chase Manhattan. They messed over all of Central America, the Rockefellers and the United Fruit people and the whole gang. And he's paid by them. And who gave the loans down there? Who brought us to the crisis? Who gave the Argentine military junta, the Nazis, for 30 years running Argentina? Chase Manhattan and all their buddies, and the Continental Illinois, the Vatican Bank, the center of Vatican financing in the United States going under, and our loans everywhere from coast to coast, the Bank of America back to the East Coast to Chase Manhattan. What a nerve for him warning on debt when he draws salary on the board of these people, and he and his friend Fritz Kramer and Alexander Haig and Vernon Walter, they brought those debts. They'll break the backs of the Americans with the debts, and he's giving a warning. That is a lot of nerve. And the next batch of nerve goes to the Pope. He goes to Switzerland, and many of you saw it. He exhorts the Swiss on banking ethics. What do you think of that unmitigated nerve? Telling them that the world of finance is a world of human beings. Our world, he said, is subject to the conscience of all of us. Ethical principles apply too. What's he talking about? Roberta Calvi, their buddy, hanging off a bridge in London, the secretary flying out of a window in Milan. 20 or 30 deaths related between the death of Pope Paul I and Pope Paul II, and money tangled billions of dollars, over $3 billion, down in Central America, Panama banks, Bahamas, dummy fronts. You go down there, there's a doorknob. There's no people, no accountability, going to dictatorships in countries that are doing genocide on Indians, native populations, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, killing off the native populations, death squads in Chile and Argentina. And didn't the Swiss banks bail out the Vatican banks? In fact, one article said that it's ironic that the Pope says this when the Vatican just assumed $250 million, which is a fraction of their losses, that involved international banks, including the Swiss banks that got burned by the Vatican. And some Swiss banks are bailing out the Vatican bank. How do they have the nerve, these people, to get up and get the attention of the news media without the news media saying, all right, we've had enough? The Pope also said in Switzerland he warned against rising materialism. Well, now that they're getting poor and their money's tied up and linked to the mafia and the death squads, materialism's a little hard to come by. But if you read between the lines, he's spending $50 million for his trip to Canada for 10 days. Is that materialism? Why not put that towards the debt before you go traveling? I'm really getting angry. I sound like Saturday Night Live when they do the news and have an interview, but enough is enough already with this hypocrisy and the silence of our NBC, ABC, CBS with the kind of stuff they're throwing out and getting away with. Many of you might have read about the two people who were arrested around the home of George Bush this last week, two men carrying a gun, a rifle, a cartridge pistol, rather, a quantity of money. One is 21 years old and the other's 19. They don't speak much English, but they're from El Salvador. Ronald Reagan went over to give a happy birthday present to George Bush to spend an hour and a half, and out of the bushes at the naval compound where Bush happens to live appear these two El Salvadorians. Just coincidentally, the same week that Dubuisson, or 2 weeks after Dubuisson was accused of having a plan to kill our ambassador over in El Salvador, just a week after Casey admitted that the CIA secretly assisted the Salvador elections, and Dubuisson was pushed aside, openly saying it, just right after Senator Helms, Jesse Helms, leaked the fact that we were funding Duarte and not Dubuisson. And then after they get the story of the assassination plot that's important enough to send Vernon Walters from the old death squad going way back years, after we get that story and he runs over there to appease D'Aubusson and Duarte, D'Aubusson's allowed into the United States. And here's two guys with a bag of money, described as a quantity of money, and a pistol around George Bush's house when Ronald Reagan's coming over with his little package that was wrapped up. They didn't say what was in the little box, but they brought him a birthday present. And the SWAT teams came, and the two El Salvadorians who don't speak any English hardly, but were on the grounds, were taken away. Of course, this was all downplayed like the Hinckley connections. What the Washington Times said, neither suspect displayed any direction or interest towards the president or vice president. Well, once they're picked up, what kind of interest would you display? It says it looks like they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Speak no English, El Salvador, bag of money to get away, and a gun that they confiscated. They just happened to be near the home located by the Naval Observatory in northeast Washington. And during Reagan's stay, the sirens came, the SWAT team, and the two El Salvadorians were ushered out. I don't even know if the charges were pressed. I'm sure they weren't. But here's the old CIA master who has Mubarak at his home for dinner, and then Mubarak goes back to Egypt, and 2 days later, Sadat is offed. These people like George Bush and Henry Kissinger and George Shultz are very, very dangerous people to mess around and eat with or socialize with. George Shultz goes down to El Salvador on a quick trick after the elections and down to Nicaragua, and all of a sudden Mr. Pastor is shot, and he says the CIA was behind it. Well, that's a little episode about the Bush-Reagan birthday. It wasn't a dinner. It was just a little gift-sharing time. There's a new book out about Ronald Reagan. It's called The Secret Life of Ronald Reagan. It's published. You can order it in care of Hustler, P.O. Box 67800-5289, Los Angeles, 90067. It's $15, or look in your bookstore. Originally, when Don Freed was writing this book, I was going to do a section with him, and he was going to come up here, but I didn't like the terms of the agreement. It didn't strike me as right or fair. So I wrote him a letter telling him that. And then he went down to L.A. and finished the book. And he had given a sum of money to write this by some backers while he wrote the book on Ronald Reagan. And Don Freed is a good writer. When Larry Flynt surfaced and was becoming political and anxious to get the rebel out, he paid Don Freed what the backers had given him to pay them back, so that he could publish the book with Don Freed. And Don was excited. And then after Larry went totally crazy and was taken to the federal pen, the Hustler owned the right because they had given Don this hunk of money. And so Don Freed was eased out, threatened with a lawsuit or eased out if it didn't come out by the Hustler publishing it. So it's Larry's name with Don. And I'm glad my name isn't on it. But you can get the book, and Don Freed is a good writer. It's The Secret Life of Ronald Reagan, and you can get that. Last week I was telling about the meat scandal, and I just wanted to update with two different items of that because they were in the news since we were on the air and shared information last week. One is from the Washington Post. Greater meat inspection authority sought, and the pressure is on the USDA by Representative Tom Harkin of Iowa. That's the fellow running against Roger Jepsen, who's been involved in the recent scandals. What he's saying is that particularly two companies, the King Packing Company from Denver, Colorado, and also another company out of Pennsylvania, the Weandt, W-E-A-N-D-T and Sons, wholesale meat, have been involved in supplying animals that died from disease and cancer, other means than slaughter, which they're not supposed to do, and they're supplying the school lunch programs. Now, that is familiar with the dioxin and the school lunch programs that I talked and wrote about 10 years ago. The USDA went to look at their records of what they were giving the poor children in the lunch programs, and they destroyed the plant records. Whatever chemicals or cancers or what the animals died of is a secret. So whoever was the recipient of this great hamburger with a lot of ketchup on it to disguise the flavor, whatever it is, they destroyed the story of the animals. When the federal agents came in to inspect the meat, they didn't slaughter certain diseased and dying cattle until after the federal inspectors left the premises. And Senator Jesse Helms, of course, from North Carolina, chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, opposes any improvement on USDA. I don't know how some people can be fascist 100%, that they don't want anything good. I can see a difference of opinion of being strong as against being weak, so Russia respects strength. But how do people like Jesse Helms, who's fought the genocide treaty and all these various things, why is he so insistent that we're doing a good job and that you can get cancer for your school lunch program and diseased animals? But once again, there's Jesse Helms opposing a change. And also, since last week when I talked about meat, there's a book out. You may have heard the author on various talk shows, Orville Schell, Schell. It's called Modern Meat by Random House. And he tells the new feed, the modern meat that they put into beef and hog and the various animals that they now are being fed exotic feeds such as peanut skins, wood chips, sawdust, cardboard dust, shredded telephone books, newsprint, including the ink, which is dangerous. And he also talks about the estrogen and things that are put in the ears of the animals and the penicillin. He was on KGO saying that there's so many chemicals that the animals can't get diseases, but they transfer to humans. So when you get a disease, your resistance is already gone. If you've eaten enough of that, you can't tolerate you can tolerate these antibiotics, and they won't knock out what you have because they work for the thing that you're now eating. They also are feeding them cow and chicken manure. They dry sewage sludge, and they get high-protein fungi that grows on waste liquid that's discharged from paper mills, and they're getting chemicals from those products. As I say, it's dangerous to handle some of the ink products, but the cows are eating it. So the diet for the steers is 60% recycled manure with no detrimental impact that they notice right at the moment, but it gives marbling flavor, juiciness. It's tender, and one problem with the poultry manure is that if they stack it too high up, it catches fire by spontaneous combustion. But if they want to feed it to the animals, they spread it thin and it doesn't catch fire. 1 minute, just 1 minute on swill, because I don't know why. There was something about that animal. When you stop the Olympic Games where people get together and you interfere with certain beautiful animals or horses, there's no stopping this chemical warfare against animals. I remember when Jolly West, the psychiatrist who diagnosed the 1 minute motor epilepsy of Jack Ruby after he shot Lee Harvey Oswald, Jolly West specialized in using poison dart guns that they didn't kill, but they tranquilized elephants in their track, and they would drop down. And the CIA has tested using these poison darts or darts on animals as well as people. Jolly West then went on to be head of the neuropsychiatric in Los Angeles at UCLA and worked with Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese on the mind control. Just one large story in the New York Times, Swale's mysterious death, foul play possible in collapse. The reason I'm interested is the chemical possibilities, just like Frank Turple said, you walk down a airplane aisle and you put your finger on a particular person and touch his coat and it will seep into his bloodstream and he'll arrive at a place and drop dead. And so I think it's important to think if they're testing these particular animals and potential winners who are worth millions of dollars. The New York Times has a story, June 10th, the Belmont horse that might have been. Now, this is the story of an Argentine trainer who has raced horses and trained in Argentina for 30 years. His name is Angel Pena, and it tells how he has a horse he's working up. Time for a Change is the name of the horse, and they wanted to run him down in Belmont, but he was sick, and that in Florida, there were 300 thoroughbreds in Florida in 1 month that got a virus. 10 days after the Flamingo, 300 horses were down. I don't remember. I don't read all the sports section, but I don't remember. But this story is about Pena from Argentina, who's very bitter that his horse didn't get into the Belmont. He was sitting on the sideline and didn't have a chance to win. But the day the race was over, he had an interview, and he talked about how Swale, quote, was a good horse. He was not a great horse, using the past tense. 2 days later, Swale was dead. And then the article goes on to say that Time for a Change will surely win in July, that he was put on hold because he had been sick, that something was wrong with Devil's Bag, but he will be swinging along, and in July he'll be running races. And then the story says that Pena won't be lonely anymore, that he was left out and dejected because his horse wasn't running, how bitter he was. So the trainer from Argentina will have time for a change. I've never told you how to bet on a horse on this program, but I am going to asking some friends who know how to bet. In July, I'm going to bet on Time for a Change, and I think I know that he's going to win that horse in July. I'll bet you anything he does. Now, to update the story of Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan's behavior, and I'm going to the Korean airline part 2 if I have time, but there were some stories that were very important to update right now. One is the Synfuel story on broadcast number 648. That's May the 7th. I did a lot on most of the broadcasts on the Synfuel scandal, how the organization, the agency, should be forced to be exposed. The chief, they suggested, should resign because of his scandals. How the Synfuel budget gave $629 million to Dow Chemical. The large salaries for these people, the violations they had. The head of the Synfuel at the time was involved with $20 million missing from a bank in Oklahoma. There was favoritism in certain loans with a gentleman from Texas. And then the prober, the head of the committee looking into Synfuels, Thomas Doherty, all of a sudden was dead. He was head of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee and died. And the Synfuel scandal has been going on and on. There's 7 men on the board and 5 have been removed, so it can hardly function. And I went into the background of Mr. Noble. It's spelled Moble, not the Noble Dynamite people, the from Europe, Nobel, the George de Mohrenschildt, Oswald's mentor, his father worked for, and de Mohrenschildt. There was the Nobel and Noble, but the background looked very similar. And I wondered where this family, who fund the Heritage Foundation, the Edwin Meese Foundation, the Institute for Contemporary Studies, the Committee on Present Danger, who sets up agricultural and cancer research. I wondered about this man who funds the Hoover Institute, where the money came from of the Nobles, because there isn't anything that I could find in Who's Who or Standard & Poor's and the various biographies on where the money originally came from. And I first read about them in that book, Reagan's Ruling Class, page 216 on Edward Noble. Well, this past week, there was a full-page picture, June the 17th, and I mean full page. The articles aren't teeny anymore. They're big pictures. Synfuel chief under fire, Edward E. Nobel, waiting for the axe to fall. He doesn't look very sad, and it tells about his corporation that was given $19 billion by our congressman for nefarious, sleazy operations, unaccountable. And this article in the Washington Post goes into the problems of the Synfuel organization, conflicts of interest, and their work with the various gas companies, and they're giving the Dow Chemical these millions of dollars. And how Reagan very nicely said, I'll cut back $10 billion because they have so many billions and they're giving them away. One was a conflict up in North Dakota that Edwin Meese came in and said you have to fund them. It seems to be an open-ended fund of people not accountable with backgrounds that are really very treacherous, or could be. Synthetic fuels were the subject that I.G. Farben was involved with Adolf Hitler and slave labor at Auschwitz, the concentration camps. Interestingly enough, one of the attorneys for the Synfuel company, according to the Washington Post, it's Edward F. Cox, President Nixon's son-in-law, who served as chief counsel for the Synfuel Corporation. No wonder Nixon's brought back into the family with these kind of contacts with Tricia and his son-in-law with the Synfuel. Well, Jack Anderson had a story this last Saturday that makes Synfuel a little more interesting, as if it wasn't enough before. And it's telling about the problems with the president's disenchantment and the money that's being spent, and how the president suggested $10 billion go out, and how they're giving out a lot of funds with strange contacts. But the strangest of all, and wouldn't you know it would come to this, Jack Anderson says, an outrageous example of Synfuel's operation is the proposed scrubgrass Synfuel project near Pittsburgh. It has the ardent support of Representative William Klinger, Republican from Pennsylvania. We'll have to look into Klinger some more, in whose district it would be built. even though the scrubgrass request for $500 million has been rejected 4 times by Congress, and 2 Synfuel officials flew to Pittsburgh to meet with the project sponsors to fill out more forms to finally get a raid on our Treasury for this $500 million that would go to the project in Pittsburgh. Now, he goes on to say that the Scrubgrass Project, the director, the chief sponsor, is called AC Valley Corporation. They never had any experience in synthetic fuels. They include a waitress, a minister, and a school teacher that want the $500 million. But behind the facade of the locally owned company, the AC Valley, with a few tangible assets, is the German name Krupp, K-R-U-P-P, Germany's munitions maker from Bismarck to Adolf Hitler, Krupp GKT, which will provide the gasification technology for scrubgrass. The Krupps have a big holding in Nevada. They had the land next to the ranch where Charles Manson lived. They owned, territory in California and goodness knows where. But the Germans would supply the gasification technology. Is that the gasification of the extermination? You have a group here with billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. Behind it is Krupp AG, which will provide gasification technology for scrubgrass. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of Friedrich Krupp, GmbH, those initials of the German Krupp, which is 25% owned by Iran and the Ayatollah Khomeini. $500 million, and the gasification process that Hitler used would be brought to America, and we would put up the money, and the Krupps would be moving into this country in a synthetic fuel project, which Hitler used. He didn't import oil during the war. He had his own synthetic fuel. So we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. And already they said they've wasted $15 billion through Congress. They've authorized gigantic boondoggle. But I knew there was a big story behind the Synfuel project. You can't get bigger than Krupp. And when the Krupp family, the head of the family, was in prison after the Nuremberg trials, it was John J. McCloy of Chase Manhattan who released the Krupps to begin their business. Hallmar Schacht, the banker for Hitler, Hermann Apps, who's helping the Vatican Bank. And so Synfuels, with their questionable background and with their country club existence, Jack Anderson says most of the Synfuel executives had searched for a petroleum substitute at golf courses, sauna baths, and nightclubs around the world. So that's your Synfuel and your Krupps. To update another story I did on the General Services Administration, that's broadcast number 642 this last March, about Edwin Meese and the links of Mike Kerb of California and the General Services Administration. I talked about Reagan's scandal because he had nominated David Cordamonche as who was campaign manager for Mike Kerb in California, to be head of the Synfuel, the GSA, the General Services, which has itself a $6.6 billion budget a year, small to Synfuel, but plenty big. The Washington Post has a story that the confirmation hearings for Jack Cordamonche will be put off until after the elections. The Senate Governmental Affairs Committee scheduled the hearings for today. That was June 14th last week. But an aide said the investigation turned down the hearings because Cordamonche was involved in not illegal but impractical activities, that he was the target for political attacks. They want to clean up his nefarious selling his business, his bus company, at overstated prices and lying, and a multi-million-dollar lawsuit about him in California. Now, Senator Thomas Eagleton, who won't be in the Congress after the next elections, wants this held up until they separate the National Archives from the General Services Administration. But he's leaving Congress. Imagine if the archives were all the Kennedy materials locked up for 50 years or 70 years that you can't get your hands on, and all this other important stuff. Imagine in the hands of Ronald Reagan and Jack Cordamonche. Eagleton wants to separate it after the elections. If Reagan's elected, Cordamonche will be in charge of your National Archives. We'll take a 1-minute break now, and if you're tape recording this, you can turn your tape over, and if you're not tape recording it, you can get ready for part 2. This is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove. This is broadcast number 655, June 25th, 1984. Now to update another favorite subject of mine, the biotech that is long suppressed in the news. That's the company that began the investigation of Edwin Meese because Mrs. Meese had $15,000 to give to this Dr. Bryan just hours literally after the inauguration, and her friend Edwin Thomas was handing over a lot of money to biotech, and I did many broadcasts on biotech and their linked corporations. There's a story by Howard Kurtz in the Washington Post this past week. Meese family advisor reports a gift of $18,000 from biotech president. Now, Edwin Thomas was supposed to get an $18,000 in forgiven interest to Mr. Edwin Thomas. But last time we saw the news, Edwin Thomas was giving money to biotech. I know that these are two high-level spy organizations, and Meese right in the middle of it, washing money, entangling money, or passing money through to other forces. There are a lot of ways to explain the money because the Meeses needed money. They didn't have to buy in a company like this that didn't have any guaranteed stock or security. That was a hard way to send three kids, or two, to college. One's out here at Fort Ord right now in the Army. The Washington Post says Edwin Thomas, who advised the family of White House counselor Edmund Meese to buy into biotech, received a gift of $18,000 in forgiven interest. The gift was made in connection with two loans to Thomas from biotech. So now biotech is giving a loan to the Thomases instead of the Thomases putting the money into biotech. President Earl W. Bryan, it doesn't say Dr. Earl Bryan, from our HEW out here in California with Meese and Reagan. Earl W. Bryan, according to the Thomas Financial Disclosure Statement released this week, it said that Meese's initial failure to disclose their $15,000 interest-free loan from Thomas that he gave to them and then they passed on to Bryan was used to buy biotech stock for the Meese family. Thomas is now head of the General Services Administration in San Francisco, and Mr. Cordamanchi will be head of the General Services Administration in the Washington National, for the whole country, when Reagan, if he wins the election. According to Thomas's financial statement, he lent between $15,000 and $50,000 at 14% interest. Remember, I questioned where he got the money to invest in biotech. He lent it, but Bryan forgave $18,000 in interest on the loan that was secured by unrecorded second mortgage on the Thomas's home in Squaw Valley. Thomas reported a $9,900 interest-free loan from Dr. Bryan that he used to buy into Financial News Network. That's one of the newspapers that Bryan also owns, the Financial News Network with its computers, one of the affiliates of biotech. Thomas reported he owned biotech stock, which he sold for $15,000 to $50,000. Originally, he was supposed to have invested in the company. Now it turns out that it was loaned. Bryan headed California's health department when Ronald Reagan was governor, and a longtime acquaintance of Meese. Imagine, they're finally putting in the Washington Post that he was an HEW out here. That's when Jolly West had the mind control program, and they were all part of the electrodes and implants, and I'll do more on that in a minute. And then it goes into Mrs. Meese, who was advised by Mr. Thomas to put into biotech. If it's confusing for you, it is confusing to the Washington Post and everybody else, because he was supposed to have been investing in the country, but it turns out that it was a loan with no interest, and that they're changing their financial records as the story unfolds. Now, biotech, I gave on this program the list of subsidiaries, the ones we know, and I was suspicious of them because they're into interferon and cancer and pap smear, and I questioned the interferon with the possibility of AIDS. Well, just this week, it doesn't mention these companies, and I don't know. I have to check all of these out. It was just in the Wall Street Journal, June 22nd. The United States agency grants licenses to develop blood tests for AIDS. The Department of Health and Human Services gave 5 licensees, hardly competitive, you'll see, because it was given so quickly, to companies to develop and distribute a blood test required for immune deficiency syndrome. A spokesman for the federal agency said the companies will get samples of human cancer virus. The scientists at the National Cancer Institute, which I don't trust, and the Disease Control Center in Georgia, which I absolutely don't trust, have isolated the virus as a probable cause of AIDS. I think they could isolate, and I also think they could make it. It says that it belongs to the human T-cell leukemia virus family. Now, they said, we're the only people who have been able to grow the virus down there in Atlanta. Isn't that cute? So the Public Health Service has the patent on the method of growing the virus and also of distributing, I'm sure. Now, these are the companies that will be working on this, so everybody who gets a blood transfusion or a test for AIDS, they'll know who the homosexuals are, who people think they have AIDS. Abbott Laboratories, North Chicago, Illinois. Electronucleonics in Fairfield, New Jersey. Litton Bionetics Incorporated in Kensington, Maryland. Litton Industries, that makes the INS service for the airplanes that went bonkers with Larry McDonald on there. Litton, that does all the detail work for the military hunters, for the military, and highly technical work, and also your wonderful microwave ovens, which I wouldn't own. Litton Bionetics Incorporated is going to get a contract for working on the blood and the viruses. Travenol Genentech Diagnostics of Cambridge, Massachusetts, a joint effort between DuPont in Wilmington, Delaware, and Biotech Research Laboratory of Rockville, Maryland. Now, that's the one I have to check in this next week to see if, by any chance, Dr. Earl Bryan is part of the Biotech Research Laboratory out of Rockville, Maryland. Also, the Travenol Genentech in Deerfield, Illinois, and Genentech Incorporated of South San Francisco. Blood banks, hospitals, and physicians will use their test to screen blood donations, and the annual sale from the government for kits on testing AIDS will be $100 million. The annual sale for AIDS disease, this contract of selling these tests, $100 million. Now, they apologize that about 25 companies applied for the AIDS licenses, but the selection of these few companies was based on their visibility, their ability to package and market and distribute the kits, and they had to work fast. They said it was an emergency, so you have to understand that very few people got a chance to bid on this. They hand-picked ones. It's a public health emergency, and it went to those people. So now we have to check up if Earl Bryan has a finger, particularly Biotech Research Laboratory, Rockville, Maryland. Now, getting on to another scandal of Ronald Reagan's involving the HUD, and that office has been in the news quite a bit lately. I don't know if you have seen articles about the Housing, Urban and Development, HUD, run by Mr. Pierce, who was selected by J. Edgar Hoover to be the token black. If Martin Luther King weren't the Messiah, they wanted somebody like Mr. Pierce. Now, I talked at length about Thomas Doherty, a member of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee for House, Energy, and Commerce, who was found dead at the height of the investigation of the Synfuel. And there's, of course, the story read Prober's death unconnected to his work. Now, here's another murder of a person whose name is in the news regarding the SUD scandals. This is out of the New York Times. Stephen J. Bollinger is dead, Assistant Housing Secretary. In Savannah, Georgia, June 19th, Stephen Bollinger, the Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, died apparently of a heart attack, 36 years old. He was attending a meeting. His body was found in the hotel room. No evidence of foul play. I guess he got the swale treatment. He was Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development, appointed by President Reagan in April of '81. He was there to address 1,700 officials at the 51st Annual Convention, and he was found dead in the hotel room. Now, he died June the 18th in Georgia. But before his death, June the 4th, and I'm not talking again about little columns, I'm talking about half-page articles in the Washington Post or in other papers, huge stories. They run like this. Staff, this is the first one, June the 3rd, by Howard Kurtz, Washington Post. Staff opposition overruled. HUD grant went to their ex-colleagues. The senior officials of the Department of Housing and Urban Development were overruled. They overruled their career civil servants last month when they approved of a $6.7 million grant for a housing project that went to somebody that used to work with them. And this Samuel Pierce Jr. is mentioned. He's the head of HUD. But through this article, they mention the person who is now deceased. They acknowledged that they were pressed for approval of the grant in meeting with HUD Assistant Secretary Stephen J. Bollinger, who oversees the program. That's the fellow who's dead, and his name is in the Washington Post. Bollinger and Mr. Wilson worked with HUD staff, and the long article in the Washington Post is about the scandal of their giving this particular contract somebody through a buddy system that the staff didn't want. The Wall Street Journal, May the 4th, has an article, Democrats in Congress seek HUD inquiry into contract to men with links to the energy. And Wall Street Journal mentions Mr. Bollinger, who will very nicely be dead 14 days later. Stephen Bollinger, an assistant secretary who oversees the grants, he's mentioned in the Washington Post. Another half-page story in the Washington Post, June the 5th, the next day. 500,000 HUD contract is blocked as inflated. And it tells about an overpriced contract, another problem, another contract that was given to a Washington consulting firm. The other was up in New England. This is another firm, and a controversy of HUD, again, granting these contracts. That is June the 5th. Bollinger has just a week and a half to live. Then there was another story this past week. You may have seen, you couldn't miss it, June 23rd. Double mystery in the case of the orphan embryos. And it's about Marius Rios and his wife, Elsa Rios, who she had a child by another marriage, and the child mysteriously was shot in the head, a 10-year-old girl named Claudia, who was shot in the brain with a bullet in her forehead. And they wanted a child of their own. They each had a child from another marriage, and evidently she had trouble getting pregnant. They're the couple who went to Australia. But the double mystery, which is a quadruple mystery, is the San Francisco Chronicle, taken from the LA Times. Again, not a wire service story. Is the one daughter was shot, the 10-year-old is shot in the head. Then the Rios go down to Argentina. They'd been to Australia to see about conceiving, and it wasn't his fertilized egg, it was hers that was taken. They were going to match with somebody else. They go to Argentina and adopt another child whose papers are on the airplane when they're dead. They fly a Chilean airline that goes over the Andes where they're murdered. The two parents are dead, but the mystery is about the plane crash because the charred bodies of the two are found. The adopted baby isn't there, but the papers, the American embassy gave them a adoption paper, and they were flying back, returning with the child. But the punchline of all this story, of the embryo story and the dead daughter and the dead parents and the missing adopted child that went through the American agency by the name of Joshua that cleared the American agency, at the bottom line, remember, this is the multimillionaire who the embryos would go to, the money would go to. Rios apparently, not for sure now, like apparent heart attacks, apparently made his money in real estate. This is down in San Diego, right around the Edwin Meese country and the DeLorean and the Pete Wilson and the various Mr. Dominelli and the mob scandals going on there and missing money and so forth. Rios apparently, no explanation, made his money in real estate ventures. He operated a company called RGR Associates, which managed low-income housing projects for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD again. Just when you read about the parents that were killed in the crash, the visit to Argentina, the Chilean airplane, the baby they adopted that isn't on the plane, and now he's working for Mr. Pierce and the late Mr. Bollinger from HUD. Bollinger was already dead when this story came out. And then another story from the wire services, June 24th, HUD in the Reagan era, abuse or reform, and it goes into the various problems, the scandals, people that have left HUD from San Francisco, from the South, and it details the scandals of the organization from Cleveland and Pittsburgh and so forth, where they're being investigated. But the important thing is that the HUD was under fire in many newspapers, the wire services, the Washington Post, and the scandalous stories of the way their money is going and how it's being wasted, like the sin fuel. And then the man who's giving the loans and grants is dead in a hotel room in Savannah, Georgia. The reason these stories are important about the sin fuel investigator or the man from HUD is that I have about 30 deaths that I'm updating each week, 1 or 2 or 3 for you, but they are falling like flies, and it is more scandalous than you can visualize. Now, to update the Marvin Pancoast trial, because this isn't syndicated in all your papers, and people are calling me, even from California or around the country, what is going on? It's not on the wire services any more than Western Gold has been. I'll give you the main key stories of the Pancoast trial of the murder of Vicki Morgan. 1 July the 11th, the first witness was Vicki's mother. Her name is Connie Laney. And the day before she was killed, she told her mother that she didn't want to live in the apartment with Marvin Pancoast. It wouldn't work out, and that she wanted to go to her mother's home. I'm taking time out 1 minute. Do you mind till we're done? Because it makes noise. It's picked up on the tape. Okay. We have a guest here in the room, and it's better to wait till the program's over. It's taped, and he doesn't know that. And so it was played on other stations. We get the rustling of records here. Okay. The first day of this July 11th story, the mother was told by Vicki that she didn't want to move an apartment the day after she was supposed to move. That she was murdered, and that next day she was supposed to move, and she wanted to go to her mother's home. And while she was out, she went with a person who she's writing a book with about Bloomingdale and the kitchen cabinet of Ronald Reagan. While she was out, Marvin Pancoast, according to her mother, showed her a suicide note, apparently, again the word apparently, written by Vicki. Now, Vicki wasn't present to say she wrote it. He showed it to the mother, so it could have been forged very easily. She's writing notes. They have all the notes and books, and the man who's writing the book has been named as a suspect in the murder of Vicki Morgan, but apparently it was written by her, hasn't been verified by ink or fingerprints, that she really wanted to die, and so they would say that Pancoast did her a favor. Now, Arthur Barons, one of the attorneys for Vicki Morgan, said out in front of the court and also in court that someone else killed Vicki. From the start, there are a multitude of other persons who had legitimate and serious motives that want to see her dead, and that their motive was to prevent the showing of videotapes depicting Morgan having sex with Bloomingdale and government officials. Now, July the 12th, the next day, this is the L.A. Herald, the other was the L.A. Times, some more of Vicki Morgan. Stanley Weisberg, the prosecutor, said that the motive was that she had a bleak future, she was agitated, and that Pancoast was treated as a slave boy, and their relationship was just not getting along, and that's why she was killed. But Pancoast told Vicki's mother before her death, the night before she died, they suggested that he wanted Vicki to go to his home, his grandmother's home that night, and Vicki wanted to go to her mother's, and they were discussing where she would sleep. And there was a quotation in the newspaper where Pancoast said to Vicki's mother, no, she can't go to your place, that he was going to resolve his problems with her once and for all. Now, why her mother went away and left him with Vicki Morgan is not explained at all, that he was going to resolve it. Now, her son had a baseball bat at their apartment, and when they went in Pancoast's car to pick up her son, Todd, who wanted to lift home from school that same day that she was going to be killed in the evening, Vicki's mother saw the baseball bat in Pancoast's automobile and wondered why he took it out of Todd's room, and he said, well, you never know what you'll need it for. Now, Morgan was, when they came to help her move, the day that before she was killed, or the day she was killed, she was upstairs asleep with Gordon Basichis, B-A-S-I-C-H-I-S, Basichis. And Pancoast was downstairs talking to the mother, and she went over the apartment to look at an apartment with Basichis that Pancoast was going to share with her. And this was the time that Pancoast shows the mother the apparent suicide note. Now, that day in the L.A. Herald, it said Arthur Barons again said that the videotapes existed, and Morgan had sex with another woman. He's specific. Vicki Morgan, one other woman, and 4 people from the Reagan administration. So he not only said people in the Reagan administration, but he mentioned 4 men and 2 women. The next article in the L.A. Herald, Sharon Porto, a friend of Vicki Morgan's mother, testified that Vicki Morgan was working on a book about her affair with Alfred Bloomingdale, a member of Reagan's kitchen cabinet. And the victim's mother told her the book would be Morgan's memoirs. It was going to be about Bloomingdale and the government and people in the government. And one of the people mentioned was Edwin Meese. That was the one that she heard. Now, this was in the L.A. Herald, but not on the wire services. Arthur Barnes, again, told people that he suspected and knew that they killed Vicki Morgan for a political reason because of political figures in the Reagan administration. Now, the prosecution attorney, Stanley Weisberg, objected to the grounds of mentioning Edwin Meese, a particular person, in the court, and court judge David Horowitz had a 10-minute conference and decided that no further questions about political figures could be asked during this trial. Here's a man who wants to be the Attorney General of the United States, and the judge orders that you can't mention them in the trial. But so that is locked up in the court for the time being. But they did confirm that she was writing this book, and they have subpoenaed the book, if they haven't erased the pages, and the book is in the property of Gordon Basishis, and it is it's not going to be public record. The book is sealed, but it is part of the trial. Another story from the L.A. Times, Morgan planned to name names, and that again brings Edwin Meese. Then a story in the L.A. Herald, writer tells of his fight with Morgan. Now, this is that writer, Gordon Basishis. The day before, or a week before she was murdered, he said, I shoved her. There was an argument. She was hysterical. There was a point. I grabbed her arms, sat her forcibly down in the chair. Now, Basishis said at the trial, the altercation came because Morgan wanted to terminate her professional and romantic involvement with him. That means that he would have no more hands on the book that she was writing about Reagan and the kitchen cabinet, Basishis. So she was taking, after all, the personal relationship wasn't much because she wasn't going to move into an apartment with him. She was moving in with Pancoast and not with Basishis. So it had to be not the personal because she could choose to move where she wanted, but it was the professional, the book. The defense lawyers claim that there is no physical evidence linking Pancoast to the crime, but believe that Basishis is absolutely a suspect in the Morgan slaying. According to the newspaper, in quotes, he was losing the book and his personal relationship with her. That was up in the air at the time, and in this time frame, he had the opportunity, as Pancoast did, to kill Vicki Morgan. So Basishis has been named. He was named before Pancoast was arrested as a suspect in the murder. Basishis was called to the witness stand, and he spoke about talking to Vicki Morgan the night that she was killed, but he didn't say what he did in the interim, or at least it's not in the newspaper before she was killed. Under cross-examination by Barron, Basishis admitted that he had been romantically involved with Morgan for the 7 months of her life while they worked on the book, but he admitted that it was during an argument the week before she died that he got tough and started to really crack her down, sat her in a chair, and was bruising her upper arms and collarbone because she was ranting and raving. He said he tried to apologize for forcing her into the chair when she told him their relationship was over, and he testified that Morgan told me the names of a number of people in the course of the book who would be named in the book. Then again, the prosecution, who wants to nail Pancoast, protested when Barnes asked Basishis to name those names, and the judge upheld the objection. Before the trial got underway, Basishis was ordered by the prosecutor to turn over the court portions of the unfinished manuscript that will remain under court seal. Then the following article, June 16th, the attorneys subpoena Edwin Meese to appear in the Pancoast trial. L.A. Herald, it says, despite the subpoena, defense attorneys are pessimistic that they will be able to make Meese testify. And the implication is the attorneys subpoena Meese. Despite the subpoena, they are pessimistic that he will show up. This is a man who didn't answer subpoenas for 3 years on the transition funds and the millions of dollars that were handed out to Helene Von Damme and Alexander Haig and Mr. Califano and their buddies. But he wouldn't answer those subpoenas. He wants to be the attorney general, and they questioned whether he would answer them. And then alongside of that is a story, Meese's role hasn't changed at the White House. While all this is going on out in California, White House, this is Washington Post, White House counselor Edwin Meese Third said yesterday that except for a brief period, he's carrying on the same responsibilities he's done during the process of waiting his nomination. He is waiting for counsel Jacob Stein to investigate the misreporting of Mises' finances. Stein isn't supposed to go into the Vicki Morgan story, and I understand from the news this late afternoon that the Koreagate scandal, the Cartergate story, rather, not the Koreagate, the Cartergate has been hushed. Now, Mises, it said during Air Force One transatlantic flight from London, he was during this flight that he was very welcome among Reagan's crowd. He attended the economic summit. I'll bet you he was over in Europe asking Paul Marcinkus how do you avoid a subpoena for 3 years, getting advice from the Pope, because Edwin Meese was taken off for the economic summit at the time of their investigating his reporting. He should be home getting his financial papers straight. What can he do at an economic summit when he can't even account for $15,000 or where his shoelaces come from, all the nefarious money that he's dangling around? But he was off with the President of the United States on Air Force One, just as the Pope is talking in Switzerland about economic summits. Mises at the World Economic Summit. No wonder our banks are in such bad straits. So then the one following article, Mises faces subpoena in Morgan trial. One said he was subpoenaed, and then the other one comes out. One was the Houston Post saying he received it. And the other one says, we are trying to subpoena Mises as a witness, but we haven't served him yet. We're having trouble finding him. I haven't seen much of him recently. Have you? This is the Houston Post. Under cross-examination, Sergeant William Welch conceded that there hadn't been physical evidence, anything to link the baseball bat to Marvin Pancoast, and there were no fingerprints in the house to link him to the murder. When asked by the defense, the police department, why they didn't look at the tapes, Sergeant Welch said he saw videotapes in the room where Vicki Morgan was murdered, and he assumed that they were commercial movies. So they asked him, being this is the mistress of Alfred Bloomingdale from the Intelligence Advisory Board, the kitchen cabinet, his mistress for 10 years, living with all kinds of heads of states and kings and Bernie Cornfield and you know what. Why, when asked by the defense why he didn't look at the tapes, the police sergeant said, I didn't go there to watch movies, counselor. I went there to conduct an investigation. I didn't go there to watch movies. And remember, the police department said I had more important things to do. Well, one more scandal. We got a half a minute here. The L.A. grand jury investigates Mr. Charles Zwick, the director of USIA. They're trying to decide whether to prosecute him for the secret taping of calls. The L.A. County grand jury has launched a criminal investigation into the USIA Charles Zwick secret taping with the Los Angeles Times reporter Richard Bergholz. So that is going on in Los Angeles. So those are a few scandals, a few murders related to the Reagan scandals, the Sinfuel, the HUD, the Alfred Bloomingdale, 3 murders tonight. I'll give you more murders next week. They're piling up faster than you can imagine. It is totally scandalous that this man can get away with this. I hope that some of you that get these tapes and get the sheets that go with them, or you can order them, send copies of this broadcast. If you don't make tapes, send the sheets. Write to Congressman, write to the names I've mentioned, write to the reporters of the Washington Post. And on the sheet that I have, it'll give the names of the reporters a lot of times. Why don't you get out there and get active and get outraged? I am furious, and I guess you know I am. Enough is enough. He's getting away with too much. So that's all I have to say on that subject this evening. This is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. Now we'll make a transition over to the music. I'm sorry. You know what happens? We're on the air. It's okay. Oh, okay. This is taped for other stations, and all the background noise gets in on the tapes when you're shuffling or moving. That's why I always say, set it up ahead if you want, or otherwise I'll give you a few minutes when I'm over. They don't care. We'll go right into the music now, and I'll get out of his way. But I get really fussy about the background noise. You'll forgive me, won't you?
Of course I will, Mae. Thank you very much, Mae Brussell. It's about 9 p.m. now.